biggest, I think, say a porn addiction was from teenage years. And if I was to begin where my life kind of fell apart was being born into a broken structure already, being born into a mother who, my sister and I had two different fathers. So it was like my mum had already had a broken relationship. Then when I was born, our parents already didn't get along. And I don't even remember that much, I don't remember that far back. But what I do remember is that when I was 2, there was a domestic violence incident which led to my dad being imprisoned and my mum having to be hospitalized and my sister and I sent into foster care. And from 2 to 4 was in care, from 4 till 9 with my mum. And I remember at that time, those were 5 years, but it felt normal living with a single mum. But then my mum, things went sour again and went into care again. And from 9 to 18, care was, I remember being in care, my personality was completely destroyed. I felt like my will was being crushed. And I remember my sister at the time, pretty much as if she turned against me. She was very hostile towards me. So I remember being 14. I think I was 14 when I first, well, I know that even when I was younger than that, I started discovering pornography websites. And I remember at 14 was like, that's when I started to become an addict. And I remember being, I think that was something, for me it was shameful because it meant having to hide. But it also meant that I was drained. So I watched how my character, I remember being 12, 13, having a bit more life in me. Then being 14, becoming addicted to watching pornography, and then seeing how my life is kind of drained, just going out less, spending much more time on my laptop. I remember being 14 and I used to be in fairly good shape, and I realized how I just kind of lost that. And it was odd because after a while, although I was still involved in fitness, although I was still going to the gym, it was still having this hidden addiction. And I remember being someone who was also addicted to caffeine. Isn't such a heavy addiction, but I remember going to the gym and I needed to caffeinate myself all the time, where if I didn't caffeinate myself, I wouldn't be able to believe in my own progress, in my own strength, my own progress. And I remember 18, as soon as I got my passport, I remember being 18, going into the shops, and that's when I started loading myself with alcohol. I remember the first feeling invincible, and I think I got addicted to that feeling. But then that's the thing, where after constantly doing it, I lost that feeling of invincibility. But I'd say that my biggest issue was being 18, going to what they call walk-ups, which is basically places in like Soho and Chinatown, where there are, they call them working girls in flats. And I remember being 18 and I remember from there spending my money on working girls, paying for sexual relations. And then being 20, finding out about these other websites and paying to meet up with these women. But then I also remember being so broken in my sense of relationship, using these online apps to meet up, like to try and get with women naturally. But even then, it was a load of lies, because I had to lie about my personality, put on a fake person to try and seem more attractive. And I remember most of the time it ended up in heartbreak. And there I was, constantly drinking and constantly engaging in masturbation. And I think that was my only way to self-medicate. And I remember going to work, and the biggest problem in the workplace is that once people find out that you're an alcoholic, I'm not sure, well, once you have that label on you, people now start to look down on you. And I know that I was struggling, I know that I was trying to hide it, I know I was failing to hide it. I know that even when I managed to go sober for 11 months, my withdrawals were bad. And I was basically they call it a dry drunk. So abstaining from alcohol, but having such powerful withdrawals. I was just replacing it with loads of sugar and junk food. And then eventually I fell back into relapse, and it became bad again. So eventually I lost my job. At the time, I remember I was looking at criminal charges. It was only looking at criminal charges because I got into, my supervisor at the time was overbearing, domineering, and quite hostile. I remember when he used one of my personal situations, because when I got stabbed in 2014, I think I was 18 going on to 19, so that would have been 2015. I remember I had to take 3 weeks off of work, and it was over something. I know there was a guy I was staying with, I was basically living in a shared accommodation. So there was a guy who was living with us, me and the other guy who I was with, and he was involved in drugs, and he kept losing stuff in our house. And then that was the issue. One day he started accusing me of stealing his stuff, and I told him that I'm not even interested in the things that he's saying has gone missing. So then he came to the house, he brought some guys with him. I didn't know they had knives, but then it turned out to be a fight and knives were used. And I remember escaping barely. And I ran to my old foster carer's house, which was luckily 10 minutes away. But I just remember narrowly escaping. Went to my sister's house to spend the 3 weeks, 2 weeks until I got rehoused. And I just remember it was a year before the court date. It went to the police. But then I just remember constantly, I tried to come off of alcohol. But then 2 months of sobriety, and I just realized I was constantly in fear, constantly in panic. The police were giving me ambiguous answers about what was happening. A lot of people in my life were too busy. I felt isolated, I felt terrified. I didn't know if I'll run into the people who stabbed me. But more importantly, it's knowing that if you are considered a snitch, people will try and silence you by force if necessary. So having to I take a lot of back roads, trying to avoid people who would know me. And I just remember, alcohol was the only way I could get some sort of bravery, some sort of, I remember after work, having to have a drink after work, because walking home and the possibility I could run into someone who knows me, and if they found out that I was this snitch, I could be, I could be overwhelmed with fear. And once they see that you're afraid, then they're more likely to attack. And they don't really care if they will eventually get arrested, because people, even if you've got cameras, even if you've got witnesses, people still carry out their crimes. But then my biggest issue came, I remember my supervisor now, they would have told my workplace that I got stabbed, and I remember my supervisor throwing that in my face. And I remember much later, because I didn't retaliate then, much later on down the line, the memory was still burning. And how could my supervisor do that? And I remember being drunk one night and making threats to him over the phone, through email, saying to him that I knew where he lived. Then the police came. There was a court date the month after, and I was terrified, thinking now I'm going to go to prison. But then they said to me, it's a 12-month suspended sentence. And I just remember just constantly drinking to numb myself. And although they gave me a redundancy payout, most of that was spent on alcohol and prostitutes. And that was my self-medication. And I just remember having a friendship at the time. A lot of my friendships got ruined. And one of my friendships turned into, becoming an enemy, because my alcoholism was so bad. And I was taking my anger out on the people around me. And it got to a point where I blamed myself. I truly did blame myself. And I thought if I could force myself to become sober, maybe I could recover those friendships. But then that forced sobriety, that guilt, that shame, it only lasted 3 months. 3 months of forcing myself to stay clean before I relapsed again. And eventually I got into work, and my addiction caused me to be unfit, and then that caused problems, because working amongst people in construction, being unfit, now meant that I was, oftentimes when things went wrong, I would be singled out. And it took me, that was 2022, we went into, I think, 2024, where I know 2024 is when I took my Shahada. I thought that if I turned to Islam, that hopefully that will force me to be sober. I thought that if I go to a religion where alcohol is forbidden, then I surely should be able to be sober. But that didn't last. I eventually relapsed. And eventually someone invited me to church. I was on and off that year, on alcohol, off alcohol. Eventually came back to church in September. And I remember saying to a woman that, well, I think that they call him Isa in Islam, and I was saying to a woman, I think that Jesus is a prophet. So the woman was saying to me that we've had many prophets in the past, but what we need is a saviour. And those words resonated with me. So I remember 2024, relapsing. 2025, I was caught up in work, and I was telling myself that I don't really have time for Jesus, which was a lie. And I remember working weekends, working Sundays, trying to get loads of money, which would end up getting spent on booze and prostitutes anyway. And I just remember eventually going on a trip called Encounter in 2025. And one of the guys who invited me to church, Adam, I knew him. We'd been attending community dining for a while. There was a charity that was feeding us. We were going to dinners on a Friday night. And I remember Adam's invited me to church. I eventually went to this trip called Encounter. And 5 days before I went on that trip, I was an alcoholic. I was watching pornography. I was paying for different women. 5 days I went on the trip. When I came back to London, because I was in Worcestershire, after those 5 days I realised I don't have an urge to go into the off licence. I don't have an urge to watch the videos I was watching. I don't have the urge to go to the places where I was spending money on intercourse. And I realised 5 days and I find myself my impulses have gone. But then I fell into homelessness, and then I was worried because I thought to myself, I'm getting evicted. And I thought, am I going to go back to booze? And I thought, it was weird, because what I realised is that despite not going back, I didn't go back to booze, but then my other problem was that I was eating a lot of junk. And although I wasn't watching those videos, although I wasn't abusing myself, I still had a very lustful eye. So I remember being out on the street, walking around, sitting around. I remember eating junk, and it's quite disturbing, because it'll be like women will walk past and I'm sitting there with my burger and my chips, and I'll just be sitting there with the lustful eye. Although I'm not practicing the lustful movement with my hand, my mind is still ruminating. But then it wasn't until I eventually came to an organisation called Growth, where they took me off the street and I got into discipleship, that I learned in the Bible. Jesus says that even when you look at a woman lustfully, you've already sinned in your heart. And I felt a conviction like, I was there thinking that it's all right. I was there thinking, yeah, I'm 2.5 months clean. I haven't been watching those videos. I haven't been abusing myself. But then once I read that, I was like, oh. And I remember, even when I was housed, I was still eating a lot of junk. And I realised that I need to start looking after my finances a bit better, because I'm not working, I'm going to be on benefits. I know that I was working even while I was homeless, but once I realised that I need to actually budget, I then started to realise that my addiction wasn't just in the alcohol and the pornography. My addiction was a heart problem. And I realised that by going into discipleship, I needed to transform my heart. And while I was in discipleship, they introduced me to, this place, our Father's house. And I remember Adam and then myself coming to this place. And it's, realising that sobriety, I know for me, it's a constant journey, because I don't think that repentance is just one thing. I think that when we recognise our sin, we apologise for it, and we bring it to God. I think that's just the start. But then every single day is an opportunity to constantly turn back to God and remind myself that I'm dependent on His grace, and also I'm being supported by people that He has put in my life. Yeah. So yeah, that's it.